lawsuits against gun manufacturers should not be a mechanism of gun control. I'm feeling a little, to be honest with you, I'm feeling a little melancholy because of the conversations that have been had across the nation today, particularly, well, really only one conversation, this conversation about Sandy Hook. I remember when I was teaching a class. It was the end of the day. We're getting ready to go on Christmas break and winter break, whatever you want to call it. And I was teaching some math course because I was teaching a lot of math courses that year. I don't know if it was algebra 2 or geometry. I don't know what it was. But anyway, I had a classroom full of students and we were just coming back into the classroom. And on my cell phone, I got a message about what happened. And I was, brand new father. And Sandy Hook is a very sensitive, traumatic point in our country. The sad thing to me about it is that I don't think we give it enough deference, especially, and I hate to turn political so quickly in regards to this conversation, but it took no time whatsoever for conservatives to immediately cling to their guns, despite small children being killed in such a horrific way. So to have that conversation come up again today, it just in general, you start thinking about the context, you start thinking about the kids, you start thinking about the children that were killed, whose lives were killed so early on. And it makes it's hard for me to talk about that because I have I think I can't call it a problem, but it's just part of my nature. I am empathetic. I really try to put myself, I don't even try. It just happens. Like when something happens, I automatically place myself in the shoes of the family, and I feel I feel, I don't feel what they feel because no one can quite feel what they feel, right? But as close as you possibly can empathize with them. I do. And so the conversation today is just, if you watched on Twitter or anything and you saw I was pretty radio silence today, that on some other things. So I really didn't want to talk about it at all. But I've had the day to think about it. And I want to say a couple things. Let's talk about it, right? Here we are. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about Sandy Hook and Bernie Sanders and the outrage, the demand for an apology, the whole 9 yards. It's been that kind of day. So Erica, well, anyway, let's start at the top. The New York Daily News. This is still fallout from the New York Daily News. I kept calling them the Post yesterday. I don't know who the heck the New York Daily Post is. I don't even know if there's such a thing, but it's the New York Daily News. And they ran a front page on Bernie Sanders saying Sandy Hook shame, basically pointing out their interview with the editors, what Bernie Sanders said with regard to this lawsuit coming from the parents of Sandy Hook Elementary. Not just the parents, but just the victims, the survivors and their families. And so let me just give the proper context before I give commentary. So in the interview, Daily News asked, and I actually just want to read it for you. And I want to read it in context because a lot of the outrage that's going around today is twofold. Some of it is purely taking Senator Sanders out of context. And then one is a deeper question that I think it's a valid question that needs to be asked. And to me, let me put the question at the top and then we'll unpack it. There's only one question that really needs to be asked with regard to lawsuits of gun manufacturers. And that is, do we believe that lawsuits should be a mechanism to force gun manufacturers to no longer sell automatic weapons to civilians? That's, to me, that's the only question that we need to answer. And then before I even go into the actual text of the interview, let me unpack this a little bit more. I'm taking my time with this particular story because one thing my number one criticism, if you've listened to me anytime significantly, you know my number one criticism of Hillary Clinton's supporters is not Hillary Clinton, it's her supporters being willing to justify anything in order to explain and justify their support for Hillary Clinton, being willing to bend on any issue, everything from single payer healthcare to all the just the entire 9 yards, that progressive values that we've stood for and fought for a very long time. I find it particularly troubling that they're willing to bend on those in order to support Hillary Clinton. And so likewise, I'm not really willing to bend on the question of guns. Let me strike that. Let's start that again. I don't want to see Bernie Sanders supporters bending on issues that at one time they may have argued the opposite argument. Now, this is just a general observation. You know, some of you who have been arguing this, you very well may have argued the same point for the last 15, 20 years. I don't know you personally, but I'm just saying for the sake of me, I'm not going to find myself arguing against in favor of something that I was formerly against, not even for Bernie Sanders. Well, hell, for anybody. Not that Bernie Sanders is at the top of that list of people I wouldn't bend for. The only person I would really bend for is me, then my wife. No, me and then my kids, then my wife. But you get the picture. The point is, I don't want to see us bending our values to support any candidate. We can just have a principled disagreement with them. In this case, I don't think that there's really a disagreement. I think there's a question that no one is asking. And that question is, what is the purpose of the lawsuit? And if you ask that question, then the final question that you have to ask yourself is, do we want to use, or should we be allowed to use lawsuits to force gun manufacturers to no longer sell guns to civilians, at least assault rifles to civilians? Now, I'll unpack all that as I make my case. I want to start at the top before I get to the bottom. Let me start at the top with the New York Daily News. Guys, stick with me for a few minutes. After this, we'll talk about Wisconsin results, and we'll talk about Hillary Clinton, her new strategy against Bernie Sanders, and we'll take some phone calls and talk about whatever you want to talk about. It's at about 9:30, 857-600-0518. All right, so the New York Daily News. Here's the question that started the entire conversation. So this is the New York Daily News. Quote, there's a case currently waiting to be ruled on in Connecticut. The victims of Sandy Hook massacre are looking to have the right to sue for damages, the manufacturers of the weapons. And this is exactly how they said it. Right? Do you think that this is something that should be expanded? Sanders clarifies and he asks, do I think the victims of a crime with a gun should be able to sue the manufacturer? Is that your question? Daily News, correct. Sanders, no, I don't. Now, there's a lot of full outrage circling the interwebs around that portion. A lot of people stop there. Don't bother reading the next paragraph. And more specifically, they don't bother reading the final paragraph in regards to this conversation. Now, I do have a really strong problem against fake outrage and manufactured outrage and yellow journalism. And if anybody I am disgusted with more than anything else, it is the slew of so-called journalists who have no problem spewing yellow journalism when they cry ad nauseum about the right doing the same thing. And so for all of the authors who stopped there or did not bother to actually journalists who stopped there and did not bother to unpack this any further, you are doing exactly what you have complained about. Therefore, you have no more room to complain about it. You can no longer complain about Republicans doing the same thing that you are doing. It's beyond disingenuous. The conversation continued with the New York Daily News. Sanders says, no, let me say, I'm sorry, in the same sense that if you're a gun dealer and you sell me a gun and I go out and kill him, do I think that the gun dealer should be sued for selling me a legal product that is misused? No, but I do believe that gun manufacturers and gun dealers should be able to be sued when they should know that guns are going into the hands of wrong people. So if somebody walks into a store and says, I'd like 10,000 rounds of ammunition, well, you might be suspicious about that. So I think that there are grounds for those suits, but not if you sell me a legal product. But what you're really asking, New York Daily News interrupts. Let's take that paragraph, because a lot of people are feigning outrage over that paragraph right there as well. Some people are highly disingenuous, and they stopped at Sanders saying, no, I don't think the Sandy Hook family should be able to sue. Some people stopped there and lost their crap. Told myself I wasn't going to cuss tonight. But then some other journalists went a little bit further and said, and included this paragraph, kudos to you. You're not quite as yellow. You're like a jaundice yellow. Journalism. This paragraph, as he has explained it, makes absolute sense on the merits of the question and the answer. Anyone feigning outrage over the question and the answer, they just want to feign outrage. If you go further to the actual lawsuit and the underlying law that is the problem, well, then we can have a robust conversation. The problem I have with this is that people are so willing to rob the conversation of nuance and context just to have a news cycle win. That's the problem I have with this. That is something that Hillary Clinton has demonstrated time and again, that she's willing to use the suffering of real victims in order to score a 24-hour news cycle win. So in the context of the question that was asked, and in the context of the answer that was given, what he said is absolutely, I don't think there's anybody reasonable that can disagree with that. If you're going to put context in it, let's go one step further. Fine. Let's add a new layer of context, which is actually about the lawsuit itself, as well as Bernie Sanders still standing his ground against the lawsuit. All right. So this is the last part I want to talk about before I go into the lawsuit, because this is something that everybody that I've seen today talk about this. I've seen most people leave this out. Matter of fact, no, I haven't seen anyone include this last paragraph. So the Daily News asked again, they said, do you think that the suit is baseless, that the lawsuit from the Sandy Hook family are baseless? Sanders said, no, it's not baseless. I would not use that word, but it is a backdoor way. If you're questioning me, will I vote to ban assault weapons in the United States? Yeah, I will. Nobody is including that little tidbit, that little bit, because at the bottom of this entire conversation is whether or not gun manufacturers should be able to sell assault weapons to citizens. Bernie Sanders said, let's skip the formalities. Let's skip using lawsuits as a backdoor, and let's just go for the gusto and get rid of assault weapons. He said, are you asking me that? I'm not going to use a backdoor, Bernie Sanders is saying. I'm going to say, let's get rid of the assault weapons. Who mentioned that in their yellow journalism hit pieces today? Not the Salon article I read, not the Washington Post article I read. Matter of fact, out of all the pieces I read today on this, there was one blog, and I don't know if it's a big blog or a small blog, but it looks like a small blog. And actually, I wish I could give the guy credit. It's, what the hell is the name of that blog? Cut the Crap or something? Cut the Crap. Now I'm determined to get you the name. Bernie Sanders, guns. You know what? I'll find it. I had the link somewhere and I lost it, but it looked like it wasn't a very big blog. It was poorly formatted. It wasn't like but there was a side blog that I read that actually gave a meaningful retort to Bernie Sanders' entire position. One that after reading through all of his attacks on Bernie bros, all of his attacks, all of his useless rhetoric on the silliness of Bernie Sanders, once I got through the first 3 paragraphs of utter bullshit, I was able to get to the meat of his argument. And the meat of his argument was actually something that I think we should ask ourselves. which is a question I put at the very beginning. Should we use lawsuits, litigation, to force gun manufacturers to no longer sell assault weapons to civilians? The entire law that's in the law that's in question is it's called the Protection of Lawful Commerce Act, Commerce in Arms Act. And the purpose of the law is to essentially stop any judge from hearing any lawsuit against manufacturers and dealers of weapons based on someone who took their weapon, purchased it legally, and used it for illegal purposes. There is only one exemption for that. There's only one exception for that. And that exception is negligent entrustment. In other words, if a seller supplies a gun to someone when they know that that person will likely use the gun to hurt people. That exception is the exact exception that Bernie Sanders mentioned in his New York Daily News interview. He said, if the dealer or the manufacturer knows that their weapons are going to areas or to people who are going to use them, then yes, they should be able to be sued. And this is what the law already says. However, there is something really draconian about the law in general. The law prevents any lawsuits for any type of, the judge cannot even hear it to determine, right? The judge cannot hear it to determine that whether or not this is something that should be fully litigated. And so it is a blanket protection. It is a bad piece of legislation, in my opinion, just reading it and looking over it. I haven't finished reading the entire piece of legislation, but it gives so much immunity to gun manufacturers that in many cases, nothing can be done to actually prevent or use laws to force gun manufacturers to make their guns safer or to get them off the streets. And essentially, that's, again, the question that we're asking ourselves, because what's going on is that lawsuits have been used in the absence of legislators being willing to actually pass the right type of law to get these assault weapons off the streets. And so, saving this one exception, you have no recourse. You have no way of suing a gun manufacturer. And so a lot of people are saying, well, Ben, why should you be able to sue a gun manufacturer? This blog that I read, and I'll find it and I'll share it, because, you know, once you get past the first 3 paragraphs of insults, you read his justification. He gives the one argument to me that makes it seem like, maybe we should be able to sue, even though in most cases, everyone knows that if you purchase something legally and the gun operates properly, it didn't malfunction, it didn't misfire, it didn't backfire. The person who purchased it legally. They went out and used it illegally, but they used it properly and the gun worked the way it was designed. In most cases, there would be no ability to sue them in the first place. Even without this law, you can sue, but you would not get any damages from a gun manufacturer. And this is the argument that this article was making, is that there are protections built into our system where people are not just going to be able to get and seek damages from gun manufacturers. They can sue, but in most cases, it would be dismissed because the gun manufacturer sold it legally, made it functioned, it did its job. And so his argument is that Bernie Sanders' entire premise for defending this is faulty, because in what world would somebody be able to actually get damages from a manufacturer for selling a product that functioned properly and that was sold legally? And so what happens is that it doesn't matter that it functioned properly and that it was sold legally. Lawsuits were still coming in by the droves. And I'm not setting this up to defend the gun manufacturers. I'm setting this up to ask ourselves a really valid question that I think we need to ask ourselves and make sure that we're not just jumping on the side of one side or the other just because our candidate supports it. When you think about this, when you think about the number of people who are killed every year, as in 2013, 11,000 people were killed by guns, and over 80,000 were injured by guns. Imagine the number of lawsuits, constant litigation. And so the one justification that actually made sense, the one argument that made sense against Bernie Sanders was because of this law, there is no pressure on gun manufacturers to do anything different with their manufacturing, their creation of the guns. There's nothing to incentivize them to make their guns, quote unquote, safer. And I'm going to rip apart his argument in a second. If you're just tuning in, you probably need the first 10 minutes of this to actually stick with us, but I'm just making the case. There has only been one argument to me that actually goes against Bernie Sanders' defense in this gun question that actually makes me even think. And that is, without litigation, there is no pressure from the common community to force gun manufacturers to make their weapons safer. And so I thought about that. I said, okay, make it safer. Should we be able to use lawsuits to make products safer? And he gives the example of lead in our homes, right? We didn't know the effects of lead. And so people started getting sick from lead, lawsuits came, and then the paint manufacturers start removing it on their own. And then legislation came along and start making sure that it's illegal, et cetera, et cetera. But the initial impetus, an example he gave was from, lead or different things that because of lawsuits, manufacturers changed their behavior and began doing things that made their products safer. There's only two ways to make guns safer, though. Either get rid of them, or this is his other justification. His justification was, and I got to get his name. I'm sorry, guy. I'm quoting your article, and I restarted my computer, and I don't have your article handy. But his other justification was, without lawsuits, then we can't put pressure on gun manufacturers to incorporate fingerprint technology to make it fireable only by the owner. This is his justification. And so, in other words, Bernie Sanders' argument is wrong on the premise because Bernie Sanders and this bill prevents any type of legal recourse that would force gun manufacturers to do something different and make their weapons safer. Out of all of the nonsense I heard today, out of all of the ridiculous fear-mongering and emotionality and the pulling of the heartstrings and the demand for apologies, that was the only thing that dropped out of the interwebs that actually made me take a moment, and not many moments, but it made me take a moment and say, should we use lawsuits to do the job that legislators are afraid to do? I don't have the answer for you on that. I have my opinion, because ultimately that's all you can make it do. That's all you're going to be able to do. You're suing them. They're going to have countless lawsuits because they are creating a weapon. They're creating something that is a weapon. It is dangerous by default. And without this type of legislation, they will be sued on a regular basis. And personally, for me, I don't think that's a bad idea because I'm just not in favor of a lot of weapons. However, does it actually make logical sense for us to use not legislation, but for us to use litigation, for us to use lawsuits to force gun manufacturers to do something that our legislators don't have enough courage to do? And even if we could make guns safer by using lawsuits, forcing them, economic pressure through lawsuits to force them to make their guns safer, will they cut down on mass shootings? Because a gun purchased legally would be coded, even if it's safer, it would be coded to the owner. It would just be the owner doing the killing, which we see in many occasions. A lot of the guns that were used were by the owner. So here we are. We have all of this outrage today. All of these people running around feigning outrage. when in context to the original question, what Bernie Sanders said is absolutely true. A gun manufacturer who creates a weapon that is by nature deadly and something that's going to cause people to be killed. But because this is the United States of America, we do not have enough backbone to just ban all weapons. We don't even have enough backbone to ban assault rifles. So it is legal in America to make these weapons and to sell these weapons. And so should we be able to sue a gun manufacturer for creating a weapon that we know is going to be able to be used to kill somebody, but they created it properly, they sold it legally, and I got a hold of it and did something illegal with it? Should the victims be able to sue? I still come up with the same answer. I still come up with the same answer of no. What about the actual gun store, the gun dealer that sold it? Because in this case, the case of Sandy Hook, they're going after the gun manufacturers. In this case, what about the gun dealer? And then I find myself making logical arguments to support positions that I can't say that I fully support, that I ever fully supported in the first place. Because when Sandy Hook happened, I'm like everybody else, get the guns, get rid of them, get rid of assault rifles. You know, I'm like, when Sandy Hook happened, I'm like, do whatever we have to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But how we do it, are we going to sit back and wait for families to have to engage in lawsuits to change the behavior of gun manufacturers when we have elected representatives who should have enough gall to actually get it done? In other words, the last paragraph of what Bernie Sanders said that everyone cut off, that nobody reported on, he said, should we use a back door? No. But if you're asking me, would I ban assault weapons in the United States? Yeah, I will. That's what Bernie Sanders said. That's the context. And unless you're going to go into the entire conversation about the law and whether or not we should be using the law in this manner, using this legislation, having this legislation block litigation, and then whether or not we should use litigation to change the behavior of gun manufacturers, unless you're going into that conversation, which I don't think anybody else has done today that I've heard. If they have, then send me the link. They probably did it better than I did. But unless you're going into that conversation, that everything else is just fake outrage. Everything else is just cheap political points at the expense of the memories of all of those people killed, also that you can win the 24-hour news cycle. That's the problem I have, that they are so willing to use the pain and suffering of anybody to win the 24-hour news cycle. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't quite know the full answer to the question. I don't think that we should put lawsuits as a mechanism of gun control. And I think that's probably the best way to sum it up. Lawsuits against gun manufacturers should not be a mechanism of gun control. Tweet that one. That summarized the entire last 30 minutes of piecing this thing together. But above all else, it shows in the political sense, it shows the desperation and the willingness of Team Hillary. And, you know, forget about Hillary. I'm telling you, it's these reporters, man. If anybody else that's going to drive me to never want to support an establishment Democrat, it is the journalists, the reporters, the talking heads, the pundits, the commentators who do exactly the same thing that they accuse Republicans of doing all the time. And that is minimizing a conversation, reducing it to the lowest common denominator, and using it to manipulate the conversation. Using a very simplistic view of an argument just to score cheap political points, robbing the conversation of any context and nuance, all so that you can get a quick Twitter score, a quick Twitter win. And they're doing this with Sandy Hook. I don't know what's worse. I don't know what's worse. The Republicans who immediately afterwards said that I understand your pain, but it's not, your pain does not take away my right to own guns, which is so callous and dismissive, or people who will use this type of situation simply to win political points in a political news cycle. But it's that type of behavior, man. It's that type of willingness to sacrifice nuance that makes me want to walk away from a lot of stuff, but I'll keep that to myself.